Hello, everybody. Welcome in, welcome in. It's very nice to have you all here. It's nice to see some people pouring in slowly. Very nice. For everybody that is here, oh, jeez. Hello. Welcome to Conversations with Authors. We here at the bookstore, or we here at the bookstore in Book Passage, both in Corte Madera and in San Francisco, are very excited to bring to you some of the best authors and conversations that you could find out there on the internet. If you've seen one of these events before, well then welcome back. We're very glad to see you again. But if you're new here, then Book Passage is an independently run collection of bookstores out of the San Francisco Bay Area. And back when crowds weren't quite so dangerous to be in, we used to host book talks just like these at both of our stores. And as we are now streaming on YouTube, and will definitely continue to do so, at least in some capacity in the future, please consider subscribing by clicking the subscribe button below. It supports us completely for free, and it lets us know that you enjoy what we're doing. If additionally you click the little bell next to the subscribe button, you'll be alerted every time we go live or post some interesting book content as we do from time to time. If you'd like to check out our upcoming events, you can find them all at bookpassage.com/event. There's no S at the end of that, just event. And if you'd like to check out tonight's book, which is The Fixed Stars, or anything else that's mentioned here tonight, you can find it all in the description below, or from me spamming it in the YouTube chat periodically. Finally, if you have any questions for tonight's speakers, for either of them, please take the time to write them in the YouTube chat. It's just to the right of the video you're watching on, or just below, depending on what version of the window you have open. Nonetheless, please type your questions out in the chat. I will read them and send them over to our authors. And although we don't get to every question, we don't always get to every question, all of them are very appreciated. All of your comments, particularly the positive ones, are shared with the authors afterwards. Now, allow me to introduce our speakers. Molly Wizenberg, the author of our book today, The Fixed Stars, is also the author of two best-selling books, A Homemade Life and Delancey. She's also the author of the James Beard award-winning blog Orangette. She has written for the Washington Post, The Guardian, Savour, Bon Appetit, and she co-hosts the podcast Spilled Milk. Also, she co-founded the award-winning Seattle restaurants Delancey in Essex with chef Brandon Petit. Sara Bree Franklin is our moderator for the day, and she is also a writer, professor, and a mother. She's the editor of Edna Lewis, At the Table with an American Original, the co-author of the Phoenicia Diner Cookbook, which is what I will be spamming in the chat periodically in order to support her, and the author of the forthcoming book on the legendary editor Judith Jones. Sara holds a PhD in food studies, and in 2020 was awarded the National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholars Fellowship. She lives, writes, gardens, cooks, and wrangles with her twin children, chickens, and dogs in Kingston, New York. We are so excited to bring to you some of these excellent authors today. We were having a good chat behind the scenes while we were waiting for the show to start. They seem really excited to talk to you today. So allow me to get out of the way, pass the show back over to them. Hello, and welcome to the two of you.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, Nick. Molly.
Hello, Sara.
So for everyone watching, we are on two different coasts, and we have never actually met, but we have been corresponding over the years, originally because of shared restaurant life and food writing, and now for many other reasons, which we will maybe get to many of tonight, maybe not all of. But I have a lot of questions about this particular book for you, which I just want to show everybody. My copy, I was reading in front of a friend the other day who said, there are more dog-eared pages than undog-eared pages. So how are you going to know what you want to talk about? And I was like, this is how my brain works. This is how we filter. We have plenty to talk about tonight. But what I wanted to start by asking is, when you set out to write this book, you have two very different books that came out into the world before this one that were really memoirs around your life and food in two very different capacities. One about coming into your own as a home cook and growing into that identity as a young adult, and the second about your newly forming marriage and the evolution of your family and also becoming a restaurant owner. So big food identity kind of chunks of your life. And this book is a very different kind of a book. And so I would love for you to talk to us for a moment about the notion of this title, this idea of fixed points or fixed identities in a life. And this book to me feels like a project of trying to re-understand what those are for you as an individual, and also trying to understand how the world was created for you in terms of understanding how we even belong within it. And that has to do with marriage and food and parenthood and restaurants and sexuality and many, many things. But I wanted you to tell us a little bit about how you came to this idea of an understanding that kind of rotates around a fixed thing as kind of the central idea for this book.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, I have always, I think that I really, growing up, believed that there was a linear quality to life, that, and not just in the sense of like, you're born, you do things and you die, but in the sense that like things would make sense. Like one thing leads to the next, leads to the next, leads to the next. And there's like a logic to it. And I saw this in, I think I saw it most clearly in my dad's life. My dad was of that generation where, like you have one career and you do it your whole life. And even though, my parents, when they got together, it was the second marriage for both of them. I knew that they had had other lives. Somehow I still perceived that like adult life had this coherence to it. Like it made sense and it moved in one direction, like the way it's supposed to go. And this certainly really appealed to me as a young person, as someone who really thrived on rules and praise and wanting to believe that I was doing that I was good, right? That I was doing things the way that they are supposed to be done. Which I think is something that particularly a lot of people who are socialized as women in our world grow up wanting to do, right? Mm-hmm. To be good, to be what we are supposed to be. And I think that's something that, a theme that I now see in all three of these books is like, how do I cope with the fact that, as it turns out, adulthood is nothing like what I thought it was going to be. And even the way that I understood like my father's version of adulthood was so, so selective. How do I make peace with the fact that actually these things, this trajectory that seemed so coherent, or that seems like it should be coherent, is actually like the target is constantly moving and it's 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. And so for me, all of my books are kind of orbiting this idea of what matters to me as a human being, and how do I negotiate the fact that nothing in my life ever holds still, including the things that matter to me. And so the fixed stars was this metaphor that I kind of stumbled upon because, in this book, one of the people that I describe dating had 3 freckles along her collarbone that lined up like really perfectly and reminded me of Orion's belt. And I am not someone who knows a lot of constellations. Like I'm like Orion and the Big Dipper. But right away, it felt really, I was going through a separation and then a divorce and starting to do things around the house that I'd never done before, like taking the dog out before bed. And I started being aware of the night sky and the stars in it. And over time, I came to think about the way that that the constellations are, the things that we perceive in the sky, these stars as being these things we can count on, these fixed things that are in the night sky. We know, when they will be in what position, depending upon what season, that those things are actually constantly changing, even in relation to one another. The same way that, that even though I feel on the inside, like the same person that I was maybe when I was 16, but truly I am still, all the facts of me are changing, despite the fact that that thing still feels in a certain way constant. So yeah, trying to grapple with these ideas of trying to get okay with change and with the realities of what it means to be a person.
Yeah, I get the sense in all three of your books, but this one most acutely, that you keep being surprised to find out that you are who you are. That this is
Yes.
like a little bit of your project as a memoirist and as a writer and your identity in general. And now my dogs are barking in the background. But that there is this constant sense of noticing a thing about yourself and going back to realize, oh, I think I knew that that was true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, and this has been a very interesting experience for me as a memoirist, or someone who, has turned out to be a memoirist, because, one would think that in order to write about one's life, or at the end of a project of writing about one's life, that you would have a certain sense of what's going on there, right? And yet I've come to see the way in which telling the story makes only a certain story within my life coherent. But there's still, of course, always stragglers that don't fit into the story. And somehow those stragglers are the parts that come back and keep surprising me. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. I mean, it makes me think you have a lot more books left in you. So there's a lot more story to tell.
I hope you're right.
I mean, you said this, and this was one of the lines that I copied down that I felt was really resonant, is how does one write about a life when a life is still happening? Mm-hmm. And that you're still, in effect, a very young woman with a lot of life ahead of you. But there is a sense that a real sort of magnitude of evolution happened in the writing, or in the events that unfolded to the writing of this particular book. I wonder if it feels somehow like you came to a different kind of clarity with this project than with your first two books about either yourself as a writer or yourself as a human.
I love that you read it that way. I mean, I think it is true. I think that, well, I've always been really interested in writing about the things that we find difficult to talk about interpersonally. And I think that any given attempt I've made to write about those things, whether it was the loss of my dad when I was in my early 20s, or the difficulty of being newly married and opening a restaurant with my spouse, I think that I have always believed that I was looking at the story as clear-eyed as I could, right? That I was writing it as honestly as I could. And that's always been so important to me, to feel that that if I was going to tell this story, that I had to be willing to look hard at it, even if I didn't like what I saw there. And I felt at the time of writing each of my three books, I felt that I had done that. But I also think that, and this is part of what is, so painful about, well, I write in order to make coherence out of my life, right? But, then because I am human, I want people to read what I have written, and I want it to go out into the world and find success. But at any given time, I have to acknowledge that what I've written is only what I could do at any given period in time, right? And only what I knew at that particular point in time. But I do feel like I felt braver in writing this book. I mean, it's easy for me to say in hindsight, like I think I probably would have said the same thing after writing the first book or the second book. But I felt braver after writing this book because I felt like I had really found some things that I couldn't explain about myself And rather than not mentioning them, I wrote about them. And that felt really good to say, there's value in not having an answer here. And it doesn't mean that I'm going to look away from this anymore. It means that I'm going to spend time exploring it in language. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. Yeah. I would love to go a little deeper into that. So for those who maybe haven't read the book yet, I want to start with the sort of central event or the initial event that kicks off the larger narrative of this book, which is that you realize within your marriage, formerly to a man, that you are changing. You have changed, you are changing, that you are not who you thought you were within the marriage. And this is based upon a crush you develop in a courtroom when you are a juror. Would you describe this person as, I believe you identify her as a lesbian, but would you still consider that the correct identifier in the after effect?
I haven't been in touch with her lately. I don't know what she would use, but like the person who I knew her to be at the time was like a masculine presenting woman, a lesbian, who she considered herself a lesbian.
Okay. And so it initiates this crisis within yourself first, and then within your marriage.
Yeah.
And so I want you to talk us through a little bit. What did you do? What one does as a creative person who uses some sort of narrative or creative expression to try to make sense of a thing, when you realize that you have built a life for yourself, in this case, a marriage, a relationship, you're a mother at this time, and the frame that is holding you can no longer hold the reality that you have come to believe is true. How does that begin to happen? And how did writing help you sort of think about what was happening there?
I mean, I think that was the crux of the problem for me, even beyond, I remember sitting there in that courtroom thinking like the feeling I'm having about this woman, and, the idea of having, it was not my first crush while being married. My husband and I were always very like honest and joked around a lot about people we had these like playful crushes on. It felt very, healthy.
And you write very openly about that in the book. And this felt different somehow.
This felt different. This had like a charge to it that it scared me. It really scared me. And more than that, I felt tremendous shame around it. Which was also very different from other crushes I had, which had also always been on male identified people. And I think that right away, the problem for me or what was so activating for me was the fact that I felt so much shame about it. And I think a big part of that shame was this sense of like, who am I if I could be feeling this strongly? And it's not that I, thought there was absolutely no chance that someone's sexual orientation can shift or, but it felt so powerful and so dangerous that it felt very destabilizing to me. And that really created a lot of shame for me because a huge part of my identity is, in being a writer and in being a writer who writes about her own life. And I really didn't, it took me a very long time to figure out how to talk about it with my then husband, which I did, in a way that conveyed to him what was really troubling to me about it. And that, as you can imagine, was really painful for both of us. But there was never a doubt in my mind that I would talk with him about it and that I needed to talk with him about it soon. Because what I realized right away was that it was like I had seen the world differently, and I couldn't go back to seeing it how I saw it before. And I really tried.
You did. You make it very clear in the book. But something else happens, and this is something I want to talk about because I think specific to this book, but also specific to the kind of world we've all been inhabiting over this last year and a half, which to me feels like a continuous reckoning, right? We're just being rolled. We're being rolled. It's not ending. There are some people who keep thinking it's going to end, but it's really not, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're in this real moment of reckoning and being rolled and tossed and maybe smoothed, but also maybe kind of cracked as we go.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I think is really interesting about the way you tell this story is that as you realize something about your sexual identity and yourself, you are also realizing that the marriage was not necessarily the marriage you wanted. It was not that it was a bad marriage. It was, by all accounts, a peaceful marriage with a good human being, but that you realized you had built a house around you that was not a house you wanted to live in, and that you actually felt like you had done a lot of it kind of non-consensually, which is something I find really interesting. You go back through this book a lot and you say, I want to go back and tell myself you are allowed to ask for blank. You are allowed to demand blank.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that sort of how that dawned upon you, but also why it felt so important to put that into this book.
Yeah, I think, gosh, I really love that question. I hardly even know where to start. I think that part of the problem for me is that I think I believed that I think that I think that I have always been a somewhat naive person. And I think that I tend to take people and situations at face value. And so when I look around me and see other people seeming to do okay in a given experience or a given situation, I assume that they have figured out something that I haven't, because they're okay. Obviously, they've got to be, they look okay. They seem to be doing okay. Clearly, there's something wrong with me because I'm not okay in this situation. And I think that some of that is certainly a temperamental thing, but I do think a lot of it is, the subtle messaging that those of us who are socialized as women receive. I hate reducing things to like women get this and men get this, and I don't believe that. But I grew up in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, in the 80s. And it was a place where, beauty was defined in a certain way. In the US, beauty is defined in a certain way. And in Oklahoma, it's like an even narrower slice of that. And also, beauty, as I understood it, even though I had and continue to have a mother who is a very powerful, intelligent, like free thinking woman, I think that I really believed that what made a woman valuable was like her beauty, the size of her body, and how good she was, like how well she could fit into the container of life that was presented to her. And the container was presented to me in the form of a really kind and creative and smart young man who I fell in love with. And I didn't know that, I just didn't understand that I could be inconvenient and that would be okay. That like I could have difficult conversations and we would hang in there, and that I could be a nonlinear person, and that I could still be okay. And it's nothing that he did. It's nothing that anybody else did. It's what I with my particular wiring absorbed about the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it is something that I now understand, is something that most of the women that I know struggle with in varying ways, especially those of us who are parents. And I think especially those of us who are in relationship with people who are socialized as men. I think it's really hard to make ourselves, to allow ourselves to, it's really difficult for me to not contort myself.
Mm-hmm. You write at one point that after you and your ex stopped living together, that you were enjoying making a mess of the place, and that felt like so incredibly good to not have to be, you call yourself a shining example.
Yeah, I felt like I felt like I had to make, be a good example. If I ever wanted like him to do the things I needed him to do, I had to hold up the example.
Right. I was so struck by that, because what it suggests is that it's our job to do triple backflips, to model it, rather than being inconvenient enough to say, actually, this is your job too, and then expect that it be fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
And that we are exhausted because of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think many of us, especially those of us who are parents, and I think particularly those of us who are mothers this past year and a half, have felt that trifold. Yes. This way in which, when the tectonics do shift, we are left holding that much more, never mm-hmm. less. Mm-hmm. And I think people are feeling really done in a different kind of a way now. At least that's what I feel like I hear through the ether. Yeah. And I'm wondering what you feel about that. This book feels like it speaks into that moment in terms of encouraging people to ask for more and different in a way that feels very, very timely to me.
It's interesting because it's interesting to experience being in relationship with someone who, so my spouse is non-binary, but was assigned female at birth. And it is so interesting to notice in myself the impulse I have to take care of everyone, no matter who I'm in relationship with. I mean, I should say, I buy into this as much as, I contribute to my own problems as much as anybody. Mm-hmm. But it is really been, I think what it's made me realize, and what I think it's made a lot of us realize in the past year is, we have to, or at least what feels different to me in the relationship I'm in now, even in this particular moment when we're all under the same roof all the time, and now co-parenting as a larger unit, we all have to be willing to not like each other sometimes, and in particular to be unlikable ourselves. And that has been something that's been very foreign to me, because it never occurred to me that that it was okay for me to be unlikable, even to myself, like just that I could be that I could say what I needed, and that I could reasonably hope to get it, even if it wasn't always fair.
Yeah, but how exhausting when you're under the microscope every single day, all the time, right? And it can never be put down.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, I have a laundry list of questions and topics that I will not get to, but I really want to talk about how you deal with guilt in this book, because it's a very, very prominent theme throughout all of the events that unfold here. Mm-hmm. And it seems up until the very end of the book, it's still kind of open question for you, which is you come back to this question of, can I grieve? Do I have a right to grieve something that I broke, that I undid? Mm-hmm. And I am particularly curious about this as it pertains to mothering. And you talk about, so you use Winnicott's notion of the good enough mother, which is this idea that a child differentiates over time from their mother, and at birth feel very attached, almost entitled to the body as one body. And over time that ideally should change, and that the notion is not for a mother to be a perfect mother, but a good enough mother who's sort of over here performing a very important function, but pulling away over time. But you go through this moment of dramatic shift where you have gone from being a primary parent, in part because your spouse was a restaurant spouse, which is a very particular kind of a thing. I also was a restaurant spouse, and people often refer to it as restaurant widowhood, which to me felt very correct.
Yes.
Which means you're often going to bed by yourself. You're doing all the bedtimes with your child. Your partner is working long hours. They're working weekends. You might be going to a restaurant or bar to see your spouse / your child's parent. It constrains your life in a very particular way. Yes. And then all of a sudden, you decide that you are going to have split custody of your child when you finally separate. And I started, I was reading this outside drinking coffee the other day, and I started just laughing because this has been my experience. As you described your newfound time as like splashing around in an Olympic pool. You're just like trying to take up all this space that felt impossibly big to you. And then you quickly snap back to saying, I don't want to really tell my friends because I feel so guilty, because I know what it's like on the other side, which is that you are relentlessly on call for your child.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about that experience for you, and maybe how it's changed since you wrote the book, because it's been some time since you turned in your manuscript. Your child is older, you've moved into a new relationship.
When my daughter was young, it's interesting talking over the past few years with friends who have young babies, talking about sleep training. And, the conversations that friends have with their spouses about who's going to sleep train the child, like, who's the one with more fortitude to like make it through the baby crying. And it like never even occurred to me, like I sleep trained her, like my spouse wasn't home. Like it didn't occur to me. And I want to say too, that he is a very, very good father. And in many ways, a much more instinctive parent than I was for an infant. I felt great relief parenting with him in the early weeks. And then I just felt lonely. And so, it was, for me, the biggest challenge, to the prospect of doing 50-50 joint custody was getting June accustomed to being only with her father at like bedtimes for those nights. And not to mention the fact that he moved into a different place. And so getting her accustomed to that place. And I as I wrote in the book, I just felt, it felt so present to me, every handoff, that I was the cause of this distress that she was experiencing. I celebrated every moment that he would text me that the two of them had some wonderful experience together, because I wanted her to have more of a relationship, more time with him than she had before. And it sucks that this is the way we got it. I know that it wasn't what he wanted either. I know he would have wanted to be around more. And now he is. He's changed his work schedule a lot and is a really, has shifted his presence in the restaurant world to be able to be more of a parent. Yeah. And so one thing that I really have felt a lot of, that I struggle with, is my awareness of the fact that experience is not typical. So my experience is both not typical of a mother, right? Like I don't have a child for half the week. And when she's not with me, I'm also not worried about her. I feel confident in my co-parents' ability and love and care. And then there's also the fact that that I know that even to this day, we've been, we separated 5 years ago this month. I know that she still wishes her family all lived under one roof. I mean, we have a drawing on the side of the fridge of like a mock-up kind of fantasy house that June sort of dictated to my spouse, and my spouse drew for her, of what it would look like if we had like two houses that were joined. And it's so painful. It is so painful. And it's not like life is that much simpler now. Now there are more adults in the equation.
Right.
With many different points of view. And so the guilt just shifts. It shifts. But at the same time, what I always return to is how much better a mother I am to her now. I mean, every now and then I will have a moment of remembering the kind of like rage that I sometimes felt in my loneliness, those nights when Brandon would be working and I would be taking care of her by myself, and just would feel so filled with rage. And when I have those occasional moments now, they feel so strange to me. I'm like, I can't believe that this used to be a more frequent feeling for me. And I just feel really grateful that I don't have to feel that way anymore or manage that as a parent.
Yeah. Do you feel like you're able now more comfortably to take up the time that is not your sort of on parenting time, with a kind of different confidence or a different ease of enjoying that space around you?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of what I learned in sort of entering into a new relationship, or sort of, navigating my way out of my previous marriage, was that, part of all the effort I put into trying to set a good example, or trying to be like the leader to make our household what I wanted it to be. I think that I put a lot of constraints on myself. I felt a lot of pressure to show that I was working, that I was pulling my weight. And, work for a mother is not something that is always or even often measured in income, right? So
or measured at all.
Yeah. And so I feel in many ways I have such a different relationship to my work and to my hobbies, and especially to my tasks that aren't income generating. And that, but that's like that. It's so interesting the way that the constraints we set up that we think will make things work the way we want them to, ultimately, at least for me, wound up contorting me into a position that was not tenable.
Yeah. That makes good sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
I want to shift gears pretty dramatically, because there's a question I really want to ask you, and I'm aware that time is passing very, very quickly. But I remember reading your first book at a very different moment in my life, and feeling like it was one of a handful of books that sort of green-lighted me to orienting myself towards pleasure through food. It was an important book to me that way. And this book is also a book about pleasure and desire, but it's very much about sex. That's the central pleasure and desire that comes really into the fore as the book unfolds more and more and more, as a comfort with taking pleasure in sex and sexuality and bodies and your own and your partner's. And you talk earlier in the book about a couple of moments when you were young, as a child in particular, of noticing things around you and feeling that sort of frisson of getting excited and then quickly tamping it down. And so I remember particular, you wrote about finding a book in your Uncle Jerry's house, which had, I believe it was photographs of men having sex together, and sort of you and your cousins found it and then closed it and put it back on a shelf. And you wrote, "I knew it wasn't for me." And then you also wrote about a book of Robert Mapplethorpe's photographs that was in your own home, where among other things, there were photographs of uncircumcised penises, and that you sort of knew that it was an art book, but you were very curious, but it was sort of, you didn't quite feel like you could access it, or it was art, but it wasn't life. It wasn't for you to live. And I wonder if now, having had an experience, which is really, I think, articulated in this book, of coming more into your own as a person who wants and feels pleasure, what you do about that as a parent in terms of talking about and modeling sex and sexuality, but also this sense that it is for all of us. And that has to start really young if it's not to feel forbidden.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. God, I feel like this is something I'm really still figuring out, and probably will always be. You know, it is, I think that, well, it's interesting that you ask this, because I just bought my daughter, like her first book about puberty. I bought her Celebrate Your Body by Sonia Renee
Can you
Taylor.
tell us how old she is now?
She's 8.
How old is she? 8. Okay.
Yeah, she's 8. And I wanted her to have a book that was hers, that was where she could go to get answers if there were things that she like wasn't like, I like, she's still of the age where she asks me really unself-conscious questions, you know, but I also fear that that age is ending. And I'm also aware that, that she is a very internal processor. And so I wanted to sort of try to give her tools to be able to learn things, even if she didn't even know she had a question about it. So I have to say, like, I was really happy for her to like that she now has a book that like shows, like, has diagrams of all the female body parts, and that's not a book for like babies, you know, that she has a book about how to insert a tampon and things like that, because I think that what I was responding to as a child, coming upon these things that were, you know, not hidden from me. I mean, my parents had a book of Robert Mapplethorpe's poetry, like, right, I mean, excuse me, photography, right out, like, you know, on the shelf. But I think that I felt, because no one in my family had ever introduced the idea of talking about these things, it did not occur to me that it was okay to talk about them. And I think that I know as a parent that for as many things as I have already broached with her, from like consent to, you know, like asking before she hugs people, you know, being okay with her. It's been really interesting with family members, watching family members struggle with her not always wanting to like kiss them goodbye or give them a hug. Like, there's a lot of work as parents, I think, that we have to do to not say the things that we were taught, and to be unafraid to talk about things as they come up. But also, I think, recognizing that there's a lot of stuff she's going to be exposed to that I can't possibly anticipate, and how can I pave the way for her to feel safe and to have a foundation of understanding her body. I mean, I think that, like, it is still, I feel like it's still, you know, you and I have talked a little bit about our wildly different experiences of dating as young people. And as I mentioned in the book, like, I was very much a late bloomer. And so I think, you know, some of what you're asking me here in this question is stuff that, like, I feel like I'm still grappling with as a human being, because sexuality was not a part of my experience as like a high school student. Like it was not something that like we talked about. I didn't know friends who were having sex, like nothing. So trying to feel my way into how to raise a child who understands that that her body exists not just to make babies or eat or sleep, but also for pleasure, is something that I feel like I am learning to embody at the same time she is. And that is my rambling way of attempting to answer that question, Sara.
I mean, I love that ending point, right? That it is, you're learning it together, but that it is for both of you, right? This notion that your body is yours to desire the world with, whatever that looks like for you.
I mean, like it was only recently that something came up. I mean, I had talked to her. We've talked many times about the different parts of her body. And we've talked before about there being like parts of her body that like, it just feels good, right? To touch them. But it's so interesting seeing it sink in on different levels for her, and realizing how radical that feels to me, because I don't think any adult ever told me that. I think that's something that I learned in books and movies, and those gave me a very limited view.
Yeah. Okay, we have an audience question, and we're so close to time, so I'm gonna punt it to you, Molly. So from Erica Lynn, this is a great question. She says, great book. One thing that struck me is how you acknowledge your privilege throughout all your struggles. Were there times you questioned whether your story was worth telling, and how did you push through that?
Yeah. This was something I struggled with tremendously through the entire process of starting to write it and then writing it. I think that there is no rhyme or reason to why, I still think there's no rhyme or reason to why I got to write this book and other people don't. I think it is a fact of uncomfortable things in our culture, like that I am white and I have got access to publishing as a younger person. And the path was there. When then I experienced this big change in my life, the foundation was there to allow me to write about it. But the truth is, I struggled with feeling like I didn't have ownership over or any claim to the material that I was writing about for a very long time. I really struggled even with using the word queer to describe myself, because I felt somehow that it was too new in my mouth and it was too charged. And I somehow felt that I needed to earn the right to use it. Like other people had to fight so hard to be what they were. And I got to breeze in and use these words and write this book. And I think the experience of writing it, and the reason why I kept writing it despite that feeling, is really, I mean, a very personal one. Writing has always been how I have made sense of my life. And if I am to contemplate something, it will be through writing. And I felt driven to spend time with these questions and these concepts and these things that I was learning, both through my own experience of coming into queerness, and also through all the things that I was reading as I tried to learn who I was. And I really felt driven to do it. And I don't know how to make sense of my privilege in that, other than trying to talk openly about it as much as I can, because I think that a year ago when the book first came out in hardcover, I think I felt terrified that someone would show up at an event like this and call me out for like not being queer enough. But I think that we can talk ourselves out of any number of experiences if we choose to. And I really needed to write this book. And so I tried really hard to not talk myself out of it.
In that vein, I'm going to give you kind of a sprawling final question or series of questions, and you can answer them how you choose. But you write towards the very end of the book, you write, it's easier to say what I am not than what I am. And I wonder if these couple of years later, that still feels true for you. And I wonder if there's any either sort of fundamental part of the book that you might alter, or something that you feel is really missing that you might want to add within that frame of kind of either claiming or rejecting certain identities for yourself.
I do think it's still easier to say what I'm not than to say what I am. I feel much more comfortable using the label queer for myself now, and it really feels like it fits better than other ones do. But I still find it difficult to, every year around Pride, my spouse and I kind of revisit the same conversation, which is that I still don't feel a certain sense of ownership over it. I still feel sort of outside of this identity somehow, not in my own daily life. I mean, certainly I feel very at home in my queer marriage, but it's interesting out in the world where, you know, because I look like a, you know, a cis straight lady, you know, most of the world asks me about my husband, you know, so I still feel it feels easier to say what I am not than to really say what I am. Yeah. And what was the other question?
Is there any sort of big picture shift that you might make around the book these couple of years later? Or is there anything you really wish that you could sort of tack on as an addendum or an appendix that you feel like is important to this story and the way it's played out?
You know, I think that, you know, I think that I would like to better drive home, and maybe, I don't know, maybe I do. You've actually read the book more recently than I have. But I think that, you know, I think I make it pretty clear that, you know, the perfect divorce that my ex-husband wanted to have is not what we have. I think that I would want to be a little bit clearer about that, and about, yeah, it is so much harder than I think it seemed to me even when our divorce was fresh. It only gets more complicated, not less. But I feel more grounded now. But I feel like the co-parenting is only getting more complicated. And so I certainly hope that the way that I portrayed our divorce or our co-parenting doesn't feel Pollyanna-ish. But I do feel that, you know, what we really have now, and what I know I did write in the book, is we really have a family here, in that, like, we don't always agree and we don't always like each other or behave well, but we are committed to each other and we're stuck with each other. And we both happen to absolutely love the same 8-year-old child. And I hope that that part of it is always the case, even the messiness of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we will end there. And I want to thank you for sharing this particular book with such interrogation and humility and Having read it twice, I want to really encourage everyone who hasn't read it once yet to start by doing that. And then maybe you'll come around to a second time. I think it has a lot to offer in general, but I think it has a lot to offer to this particular moment. I know a lot of people are feeling a lot of struggle within their families and relationships at this moment. And I think there's a lot of seenness and validation to be had in this book. So I want to thank you for that.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. I've loved talking with you, and thank you for all that you brought to your reading of this book.
It's my pleasure.
I absolutely agree with everybody here. Thank you to the both of you for coming out tonight. Both for hosting and asking such excellent questions and being so excellent with the run of the show, and also for providing such insightful answers, and I think most importantly for writing such an excellent and insightful book. But I would be remiss not to thank everybody at home for coming out tonight. It was really, really great to see so many people come out. I'm always very excited to watch the numbers go up and up in chat. So it's very, very pleasant to see all of you today. I do hope that if you enjoyed yourself, you can support us for free by clicking the subscribe button and by hitting the thumbs up button that's under the video to pay homage to the great YouTube gods, so that we can get our channel out to everybody, all of our conversations out to everybody, and to get this interview out to as many people as possible. So thank you one last time for coming out tonight. Thank you, both Sarah and Molly, for coming out here and talking about your stuff. Again, everybody's books are in the description below. You can click them. It'll take you right to our website. We can ship them to your house, just like any other online retailer that exists out there in the world. Or, better yet, you can go to your local independent bookstore and order it from them. Even if it's not us, even if you live on the other side of the country, I'm sure there's somewhere around you where you can go get a book from somebody else who's sitting behind a counter and trying to do something else other than shelving books. I'm very, very excited. I'm really glad that we had this really excellent conversation. So thank you one last time for coming out tonight, everybody. I will see you in the next one.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.